Hi everyone. Elsie asked me to take a few minutes to share some of what has worked for me in the classroom over Zoom using breakouts. So I thought I'd share some highlights from a lesson that I did towards the end of the spring semester and share some reflections on what seemed to work well. Um, so this is actually the agenda for that class. Usually Rabbinic Civ would have been a 3-hour long class. And when we were still meeting in person, I designated about an hour of each day for something that I called lab. And lab was really where students would work in small groups or chavruta with primary sources. And they often had some questions that would be an invitation to make a connection between the primary source and one of the secondary sources that they had read for the day. So what happened when I moved online is I realized that the 3 hours didn't work, nor did it work to save the breakouts or the lab till the end of the day. And so I shrunk the day from 3 hours to 2 hours, and I put the lab right in the middle so that the breakouts really became the centerpiece of our time together. This is sort of how a typical day would go. I would take a pretty extended amount of time to do check-ins, sometimes kavanot, sometimes there'd be a little opening activity, sometimes a poll, so everybody would get a chance to say how they were doing or dedicate the learning for the day. Or share a song or wisdom or something like that. And then I would use the bulk of the time in class to explain to them what they would be doing in lab and why it was important, how it connected to the overarching learning goals. They'd spend around 45 minutes, sometimes even more, in breakout groups. They'd take their break during that time. And then when we came back, there'd be report backs from breakouts and then some discussion. And we would close with some kind of final thoughts or reflections and a closing blessing. So it's a pretty typical day. Beyond putting the breakout in the middle, the other thing that really helped me chisel down the time that we were together on Zoom is doing these recorded lectures, often with a PowerPoint. And for this particular day, they watched 2 mini lectures, 2 15-minute lectures from me, in addition to some secondary reading they did. So I liked assigning people to breakout groups so I could make sure that there were strong people in each one. What worked really well about this day that I'm talking about is the source that I had chosen for us to study was a very long and involved composite narrative from the Talmud that I had broken down into 5 sections. So this was one of the occasions on which the lab involved the different groups actually doing slightly different assignments. And I think it made for actually a much more successful lesson than it would have been otherwise. So I kept this slide with the instructions about what everybody would be doing in their breakout group up on the screen in the main room. But of course, they were all in breakouts, so they didn't have access to these instructions. And that's why I spent a good amount of time reading through everything about what they were going to do when I put them in their small groups. Some of this they did every time, but I would repeat it nonetheless. I'd repeat that they needed to take their break during the time that they were in their breakouts. I would let them know that they would be reporting back responses to the key questions, and part of what they would do in breakouts is make a plan for who was going to report back. And oftentimes they would divide it up. So in fact, one of the benefits of the breakout groups is that everybody would come back to class ready to have something to say, and we generally hear from everyone. So on this day, I had everybody in every group read this long story This was the story of how Rabban Gamliel is kicked out of his position after an episode in which he's acting particularly imperiously. He's kicked out, and then there's this moment of tshuva, and he's brought back in. It's a very resonant story for rabbinical students because all of the politics happen within this academy. There's a lot of power plays. There's move towards greater access, but it's also a great illustration of how the values and cultures of the later rabbis associated with the period of the editing of the Babylonian Talmud, their values, they're really committed to this sort of competitive style of learning. They infiltrate the story. So even though the story is about characters from earlier in rabbinic history, there's all of these hints about the later rabbinic culture from Babylonia. So that's why it's just a great text with nice social justice themes as well. So they always like it. But first I have everybody read the story, and there's weird things that happen in the plot. So their first task is to make sure they know what's happening. By the way, when they're in their breakout groups, these instructions are up in the main room, and I'm hanging around in the main room. Periodically, I write to them and let them know how much time has passed or how much time has gone on. I invite them to come see me in the main room if they have questions, or to invite me into their room. But I generally don't drop in on them uninvited. I had a number of questions for all of the groups, but they're answering them in response to their section of the story. So one of their main tasks is actually to use their section of the text to engage the secondary reading. And for this day, they were reading 3 chapters from a book about the culture of the Babylonian Talmud by Jeffrey Rubenstein. The chapters were on dialectics, violence, and shame as core themes. So I was asking them in their section, how do these themes come up, or if they came up? Doing that work, trying to apply the secondary reading to the text is a great way to sort of evaluate, to recapitulate his main argument, but also to evaluate the argument and to internalize it. So that was one task. Another task was for them, based on all of the materials that I had pre-gathered for them. I found variants and parallel texts and sources from mostly from earlier rabbinic literature. So I was going to ask them, and it was all on this Sefaria document where they had their main text as well, to see if their section of the story had a variant or an earlier version, and if so, how the material had been reworked. So this is sort of another opportunity to practice applying the kind of methods they're learning from the secondary literature to a primary text. And then they had some general questions. What can we learn from the section about history and culture in the time of the characters? And what can we learn about it, history and culture, from the time that the Bavli is edited? Oh, sorry about the typos. But just another exercise in doing the methods that allow for a civilizational perspective. So they have 45 minutes altogether. I'm giving them probably 2 or 3 reminders and checking in with each group, sometimes just sending a message through the Zoom to see if they're okay, but oftentimes they'll reach out to me for clarification about something. That's all I got for you. Let me say that I think one reason that this worked very well is because since the different groups were all looking at different material, when they came back, they were all eager to share what they learned. We heard from everybody on this particular day. And it did allow us to open into a larger conversation about the main topic for the day, stem theory, and to get at these larger historiographic questions that they were equipped to address in a deeper and more sophisticated day. So Happy to talk more about breakouts and enjoy the rest of your day.